We talk a lot about the big picture of the Indian economy, but sometimes the really interesting stuff is happening at the local level.
Yeah, I think that's right.
You zoom in and look at what's going on, and that's where you find these surprising stories of growth and success. And one place that's been grabbing my attention lately is Telangana.
Yeah, it's been on my radar too. What's been catching your eye?
I've been digging into some recent data, and I think the Deputy Chief Minister's budget speech, well, it's not exactly light reading, but there are some real nuggets in there. Telangana is like really outperforming, and I'm curious to pick your brain about what's behind it.
Absolutely. I'm happy to dive in. When we look at national data, it's easy to miss those pockets of unique activity, right?
Yeah.
So a deep dive into a specific state can really help us understand those finer details.
Right, exactly. So, first off, the numbers themselves are pretty impressive. Telangana's gross state domestic product for the fiscal year 2024-25, that's like the total value of goods and services produced in the state, it's grown by 10.1%.
Okay, and how does that compare to India's overall GDP growth?
Well, India's growth is estimated at 9.9% for the same period. So, might not seem like a huge difference, but it's significant. Think of it like two runners in a marathon.
Okay, I'm with you.
If one pulls ahead right at the end, even by a little, that shows a different level of stamina and strategic, pacing. And Telangana, economically speaking, they've found that extra gear.
Interesting analogy. So they're pulling ahead, but what does that look like in actual rupees?
Right. So in absolute terms, Telangana's GSDP has reached 16,012,579 crore.
Okay.
And to compare, India's GSDP, of course, it's much larger, stands at 3,031,003,215 crore.
All right, so that gives us the big picture, but how is that growth trickling down to the average person in Telangana?
Yeah, that's where the concept of per capita income comes in. It gives us a more relatable way to grasp how this growth is actually affecting people's lives.
Right, it's the measure of individual prosperity, right? How
Yeah.
much is the average person making?
Exactly. So in Telangana, per capita income has reached 3,709,751. And get this, it's growing at a rate of 9.6%.
Wow, and how does that compare to the national average?
India's per capita income is currently at 2,005,579 with a growth rate of 8.8%.
Okay, so there's a pretty stark difference there.
Yeah, Telangana's per capita income is almost twice, like 1.8 times higher than the national average.
Hmm.
That's not just a statistic. It reflects a real difference in living standards.
Yeah, that's a really significant gap. What do you think are the main factors driving that?
Well, one key factor seems to be the level of workforce participation. Telangana has a labor force participation rate of 68.7%.
Oh.
That's notably higher than India's average of 64.3%.
Interesting. More people working generally translates to more economic activity, right?
Yeah.
Is there anything else in the workforce data that stood out to you?
Yeah, actually, the female workforce participation rate in Telangana is particularly impressive. It's 52.7%. The national average is about 45.2%.
So that suggests a more inclusive economic environment, right? More women engaged in the workforce. That's pretty significant.
Absolutely. Now let's shift gears a bit and look at the different sectors of Telangana's economy. The service sector is definitely the big player here.
Okay.
It contributes a whopping 66.3% to the state's gross state value added, or GSVA. Think of that as the value added by each sector during the production process.
Right. So what's driving that dominance in the service sector?
While Hyderabad, it's become a major IT and fintech hub, there's this huge concentration of software companies, tons of fintech startups. It's fueling job growth across the board. Software development, data analysis, logistics, even tourism gets a boost because of the influx of professionals.
Right. It's like a whole ecosystem built around that tech sector.
Yeah, and the ripple effects are pretty widespread.
Makes sense. But I imagine other sectors play a role too, right? Even
Yeah.
if they're not as dominant as services.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Agriculture and its related sectors might contribute a smaller percentage to the GSVA, about 17.3%. But they still employ a massive chunk of the population, like 42.7% of Telangana's workforce.
Right. So it's still a crucial sector for a large portion of the population's livelihoods. What kind of government support are we seeing for agriculture in Telangana?
Okay, so there's a lot going on. Free electricity for farmers, which is huge. Then there's the Rythu Bharosa scheme that provides direct financial aid to farmers. And on top of that, you have crop loan waivers and major investments in irrigation infrastructure.
So it's not just about keeping agriculture afloat, it's about actively trying to increase productivity and incomes.
Exactly. And then there's the industrial sector, contributing about 16.4% to the GSVA and employing around 22.5% of the workforce. And the government seems to have a pretty clear strategy for boosting this sector as well.
I've been hearing about this China plus one strategy.
Yeah, that's it. Basically, there's a global push to diversify supply chains, not relying too heavily on one country. Telangana sees this as a chance to become a major manufacturing hub.
Interesting. So which industries are they targeting?
Pharmaceuticals is one. Hyderabad already has a strong base there. Then there's biotechnology, electric vehicles, and renewable energy. All these future-focused industries with tons of potential for growth and creating skilled jobs.
Makes sense. And how are they attracting investment in these areas?
Well, they're developing these dedicated industrial corridors and special economic zones, SEZs. Think of them as like specially designated areas with all the right infrastructure and streamlined regulations to make it easy for businesses to set up shop.
Ah, so they're creating a really attractive environment for businesses to invest.
Exactly. And it's hard to talk about Telangana's success without mentioning Hyderabad again.
Right. It's the heart of a lot of this growth.
It's not just an IT hub, it's a center for innovation. The research and development happening there spills over into so many other areas, and the tech sector's success creates demand for all sorts of other services. It's like this engine driving a whole ecosystem of growth.
And it sounds like the benefits aren't just limited to a small elite, right? There's evidence of positive impact on women and marginalized communities as well.
Yeah, and that's really encouraging. It suggests that the growth is more inclusive, reaching a broader segment of society. It's not just concentrated at the top.
That's a really important point for sustainable development. When the benefits of growth are shared more widely, it's more likely to be lasting and have a real impact on people's lives.
Right, totally. So, pulling it all together, the data tells a compelling story about Telangana. Strong economic performance across the board, from overall growth to per capita income to workforce participation. They're clearly outpacing the national average.
Yeah, and there seems to be this really interesting synergy happening. A booming service sector centered in Hyderabad, proactive support for agriculture, and a clear vision for industrial growth. It all seems to be working together.
Yeah, and that's what makes this so fascinating. But it also raises some big questions like, what does this mean for India's economic landscape in the long run? Will we see a widening gap between high-performing states like Telangana and others?
Yeah, that's definitely a question worth pondering. And what about the lessons other states can learn from Telangana? Can they replicate this model? Or are there specific factors at play that are unique to Telangana?
Lots to think about. Telangana's success story is definitely one to watch. It's not just a regional phenomenon. It holds some potentially valuable lessons for the entire country as we grapple with these complex issues of economic development.
I couldn't agree more. It's a microcosm of a lot of the broader trends happening in India, and it'll be interesting to see how things unfold in the coming years.
Definitely. Thanks for joining me for this deep dive. It's always a pleasure to unpack these economic puzzles with you.
Likewise, it was a great discussion.